3:15 a.m. That's the new fun time that my body has decided it wants to wake up these days. Hopefully it's just a season that I'm in. But no matter how early or late I go to bed, no matter how early or late I wake up in the morning, 3:15 a.m., boom, wide awake. And you know what happens next. All the things that go through your mind that time of night. Who's mad at you? The tiny thing that you forgot to do at work that you sure is going to get you fired. Getting mad because you can't go to sleep. Panicking because you've got a big day tomorrow. Maybe even a sermon that you've got to preach. Eventually, after miles and miles of racing thoughts and a few Jedi mind tricks, I do manage to get back to sleep. Sometimes being awake ain't great. Sleepers wake, give me a break. Can't we all just go back to sleep? We've been hearing a lot these days about that word, haven't we? Wake, awake, woke. It used to be a good thing, as I remember it. Being awake meant being attentive. Being awake meant that you acknowledged the space that you take up on this planet and the space that other people need. To be awake meant a certain degree of self-understanding, especially as it relates to how we're called to live together with each other. To be awake, in other words, is an awareness about how we live and move in the world, aware of our own footprint and impact. But then at some point, the whole thing about being awake turned, and it became a less positive thing. I read messages from some of my friends complaining about their woke friends. And by this, I imagine they mean people who are more progressively inclined, you know, those who care about others. So it seems like to be awake in this worldview means to be unrealistic or lofty in some way. So as I usually do, I did a simple study of the word wake. And this is what I turned up. And you might see where you connect or where you relate. Awake, as a noun, is something that follows close behind, such as a track made by a vessel as it moves through ice. The wake of a ship. Or perhaps you've attended a wake. We have a wake, sitting up with the dead before their burial, an ancient practice. Wake can mean to arise, revive, or originate, spring into being, be strong, be lively. Or the one that I think is most helpful for us as spiritual people is that the word wake and watch come from very similar places. Wake and watch, as in keeping a vigil before a feast. Sleepers wake, says the hymn. And it looks like Jesus also has a thing or two to say about the spiritual condition of being awake. In Matthew's gospel, the author is addressing something that's on the mind of the people. And what is on the mind of the people? Well, it's when that last great day will come to bring all of creation not only to its end, but to its fullness and its completion. And you see, in those first Christian days, they thought that that return was imminent. It was on the horizon. They could see it coming. It could happen any moment, any day, any minute. There was a real sense of urgency in those first moments of the church. But gradually, when it didn't happen today or tomorrow or next week, the church began to reckon with the question of how to be around a little while. They began to think, we might have to be here for a bit. So how do we live with this sense of urgency and expectation, but also with the realization that it might stretch out not to be today, this week, this month, or this year? It was a big turn for the early church. So when the disciples are talking about this with Jesus, they're wondering, when's it gonna happen? Everybody's been telling us it's gonna be immediate, but it's not. So they're talking about it with Jesus. When, Jesus, they say, when? When will all of this great coming happen? And so Matthew's Jesus says something very interesting here. And it's important to pay attention to the translation. What Jesus says here is, I don't know. You got me. He doesn't know. And I think that's really interesting, because if Jesus doesn't know, and Jesus knows everything, but he's saying it's only God that knows. God is on God's own timeline where this is concerned. But Jesus does say something important. He does say, while he doesn't know the time, he does point to a way that you and I are supposed to live together. And what he does here is he points to the story of Noah. And this is really cool, because remember that Noah was really living in the midst of some rabble-rousing times. The leaders were unfair, and the people were basically ungrateful and stiff-necked still. And Noah tried to convince them to change, repent. That age-old message of Advent. Noah tried to get them to change, to be more conscientious and kind, but they refused. And as our translation says today, before the flood, everyone was carrying on as usual, having a good time, right up to the day that Noah boarded the ark. So in other words, those people were not awake. And the floods came and swept away all of those sleepy folks, those who weren't paying attention to the storm clouds and the raindrops that were hitting them on the head. So Jesus says, stay awake and alert. Awake. Jesus' words, not mine. So how do we stay awake? How do we stay attentive when all we want to do is climb back into bed and pull the covers over our heads and wake up when everything's better? Well, I think that the term woke has been hijacked to some degree. And here on the first Sunday of Advent, we are here to spiritually reclaim it. Reclaim the discipline of being awake. Now is the season of paying attention to how God is inviting you to live. How are we living? Not under the threat of the end of the world, but how are we being stewards of the time that we've been given? How are we being stewards of the world that is in our charge? How are we caring for the generations that are on deck behind us? How are we being awake to how people are being treated? How are we being awake to how careful and thoughtful we are? How are we awake to how much space we take up, both physically and emotionally? How are we awake to our connection to God, self, planet, and other? Being awake means being alive to the ways that the image of God is showing out and showing up in me and in you and in all of us. I think that's one of the reasons that the tradition of the church during Advent is to forego the fancy. Shopping malls, they may glitter with gold and silver, but here in the church, we scale back. We prepare with simple cuts from nature, candles, lights. And there's a reason that out of all the trees that are in the wood, the holly bears the crown. Seeds, pine cones, fir trees, garlands, wreaths, where chipmunks chirp and squirrels scurry and birds delight in the sheer winged joy of having wings. Wake to the places in which God goes nuts over the small things. You know, it occurs to me that whenever we talk about being awake or being attentive, it's usually in two different occasions. The first one, occasion one, we're watchful when we feel we are on attack, on guard, approaching armies, or in my case, spiders, snakes, scorpions, those things that are out to get us. Be watchful. That's occasion one, to be watchful. But occasion number two, the second occasion that calls us to be watchful, is when we're looking out for something special, something unique, rare, extraordinary, meteor showers, and migrating cranes passing through. We watch for woodpeckers or pods of whales. Where are they? We ask, not wanting to miss one moment. We watch, we watch, we watch, we watch, we watch for the majesty and mystery of God. Sleepers, wake to the beauty of the world. Wake to the image of God in yourselves. Wake to the ways that God is present in the small, mysterious, and yes, even the infuriating, complicated corners of life. Can't we just go back to sleep? No. Because if you do, you just might miss God. So, my woke Christian friends, please get your rest in this season. Don't forget to take care of yourselves. And do so in a spirit of wakefulness. As the stars fall into alignment and the angels tune their trumpets and the shepherds tingle with a sense of what's next? How are you being awakened? In what ways is Jesus, the Lord of life, taking your hand, opening your eyes, and bidding you wake?